This is our teaching video for the ninth commandment, you shall not covet your neighbor's house. A reminder now as we come to the end of the 10 commandments, you need to have them memorized, and we will have a little written quiz for you. Nothing to be frightened about, but something to show that yes, you have actually learned the material we're presenting to you. And the quiz will have very simple questions. List the 10 commandments in order. What's the first table of the law? What's the second table of the law? Things we've talked about. And really, the quiz is just a way for you to gauge whether you've actually learned it or not. And it's a way for us to gauge that, too. Well, you may remember now that we can number the 10 Commandments in two different ways. And if you number them the way that we do, and the Roman Catholics, which is the medieval way, 9 and 10 are two commandments about coveting. Now, the word covet is not a familiar word. None of you are like, oh, dude, I covet that shirt, bro. You don't do anything like that because the word coveting is kind of an older word, but it's an important word. And it may actually be why these two commandments get split into two, because when we talk about coveting, we're talking about the D word, and the D word is desire. Now take a moment and think about this. The second table of the law, which is commandments 4 through 10, have a lot of action commandments. Now we expanded the ethical meaning of them beyond just actions, but in their simplest statement, do not murder means don't go out and kill people. Do not steal means don't go out and take stuff that's not yours. Do not commit adultery, don't go out and break up someone's marriage, or don't break up your own. Those are actions. But notice these last two commandments aren't about you doing anything, they're about desire. Now, if you remember, we talked about murder having the desire of anger. We talked about adultery having the desire of lust. And so really, these last two commandments are going to kind of bring us back to what's in the heart. And that's why maybe, again, they're split into two commandments, because we're going to talk about two different kinds of desire. Now, the first kind of desire we're going to talk about has to do with this guy. And maybe you know who he is. Naked little guy with angel wings and a bow and arrow. And if you guessed Cupid, that's exactly right. And the word Cupid in Greek simply means desire. So you know if Cupid comes and strikes you with his arrows, then you will fall in love, a kind of erotic desire. So that's what I want you to think about. There's a longer theological word that we're not necessarily going to teach you, but just remember Cupid. And sometimes we'll talk about cupidity, or even the long theological word is concupiscence, having to do with Cupid. You're desiring this. So just remember Cupid related to desire, and what we're going to say is misguided love. Misguided love. You see, this is when we talk about Christian ethics, we're not talking about you going out and doing bad things. Because most of you, if someone says, let's go do a bad thing, you'll say, I'm not sure I want to do that. But what if it's something you do want? What if it's something you do love? What happens when our love is attached to the wrong thing? So this is another word we'll use, is attachment. I mean, think of just grabbing something with your hand. I'm holding my desk right now. I'm attached to it. And if I don't let go, I'll have problems if I'm attached to this desk. Well, your love can get a grip on things and get you stuck. And that's what these commandments are all about. So, cupidity, desire, misguided love, attached to the wrong things. Now, another way you can think about misguided desire is you can think about pollution. All right, we know about car pollution, we know about smog, we know about pollution of water. I know you guys get stuff in school about pollution and the environment. This is the pollution of the clear stream. So imagine water running clear, and then imagine making that water really dirty. And that's what we're talking about with misguided desire. And imagine now the pollutant is lust. So this clear stream of water, maybe you can think of friendship, and it gets spill black paint or spill black ink into the water. The water, which was clean and pure, now becomes something that can't support life. And so this is an image the early church used, St. Augustine used, of a clean river of water that then became dirty. And now, guess what? All that Taizé music you all sang at the beginning of confirmation helps pay off. Because remember one of the songs we sang for the first 5 or 6 weeks? Blessed the pure in heart. So now we're not talking about a stream of water, now we're talking about the purity of your hearts and that there's a blessing there. And do you remember, blessed the pure in heart, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. So God's very kingdom is given to those who are pure of heart. So what's at stake with these commandments is that if your desire attaches to the wrong thing, namely what belongs to your neighbor, your heart becomes polluted, and maybe then that kingdom of God that you're called to participate in is obscured. So you end up not living the life God wants you to have. And that's why these two commandments about desire are so important for us to unpack. Now, if you look at your small catechism, Martin Luther gives us two negatives and a positive with this commandment. So remember, we've done that. We've talked about the you shall nots and the you shalls. So two negatives and one positive about how we live out this commandment and what it has to do with our desire. So when he says you shall not, he says two things. First, we do not desire to get our neighbor's possession by scheming. So desire, and what is that desire attached to? The possessions of the neighbor. Now this is very easy. Think of stuff your friends have that you would like to have. And think of things you would like to have so bad that you might do something to get them. Remember I told you that story about David and Bathsheba where he desired the wife of another person. You see, and that desire is what led him to take her, to commit adultery with her, and then murder her husband. And so desire leads to possession, and if we're crafty, which many of us are, it also leads to scheming. Because very few of us are just going to take from the neighbor what belongs to them, a kind of blatant thievery, though that's oftentimes what we do. And so then we start scheming. How can I trick this person out of their possessions? What can I do to get it and to make it appear like I'm a good person? So notice how misguided desire that attaches itself to the neighbor's possessions will begin to twist your ethics. And again, remember that stream of water, the purity of heart begins to be cloudy. Well, this leads us then, the scheming leads us to the second negative that Martin Luther brings up. He says, do not pretend you have a right to them. Do not pretend you have a right to them. Now notice what he's saying here. So let's say you want your neighbor's stuff and you start scheming. And then you say to yourself, you know what? What my neighbor has actually belongs to me. And here's the reasons why it belongs to me. And notice now, you're not presenting yourself as a thief. You would never call yourself a thief. But now you're coming up with reasons why what your neighbor has actually belongs to you, and so you pretend you have a right to the neighbor's possessions. And so notice, desire has attached itself to possessions, which leads to a kind of clever scheming, which leads now to pretending that we have a right to the neighbor's stuff, and we take it, and after we take it we say, thank God that justice has been served, thank God that the right thing has been done. And so this is one thing that God is telling us as a warning. Don't do that. If you desire your neighbor's possessions, you need to check yourself. Be thankful that your neighbor has what they have. And don't say, you know what, that belongs to me, and I have a way I'm going to get it. Now this is why, again, this language of coveting is not language that we use often, but it's now checking at the heart the sources of our desires. Now, if we have those two negatives, then what is the positive that we have in this commandment? And what Luther says is the positive is always help your neighbor, always help the neighbor keep what they already have. Help them keep what they already have. So think about this. You're happy that your neighbor has what they do, and that you will take steps if someone comes with a scheme to dispossess them. Then you stand up for the neighbor and their rights. And notice, this now fits with when Jesus tells us the second greatest commandment is love your neighbor as yourself. You are extending to the neighbor the same grace that you would hope they extend to you. That if someone were to come with a scheme and pretending to have a right to your possessions, that someone would stand up and help you keep what you already rightfully have. Now I want to bring you back, as this video now comes near to a conclusion, to those two words that we often saw in the explanation to the Ten Commandments, to fear and love God. Now, if you remember, fearing God means God is God and you are not. right? So it's not saying, oh, be afraid of God like a ghost in a haunted house. And then, of course, love is more apparent. But now this is where we get this sense of desire. Direct your desires towards God. I mean, there is a lot of stuff in the world to be had. There's a lot of stuff that you will say, I should have that. Why don't I have that? Not only physical things, it could be cars, it could be clothes, it could be looks. Oh, I wish I looked like that other person. Why don't I look like that? It could be vehicles, it could be homes. That's actually in the next commandment. We're going to talk about the desire which turns to a kind of greed for the distinct possessions of the neighbors. So how do we have this as an antidote? Well, remember, we are to fear and love God. So direct your desires toward God, and then let everything else fall out of that. So we're just going to put fall out of that. That's why Jesus says in the same Sermon on the Mount, where he's giving all this great advice to everyone, seek first God's kingdom, and after that, everything will come to you. Direct your desires toward God first, and then, as it relates to possessions, as it relates to relationships, as it relates to everything else, your life falls into proper shape. It doesn't mean you get everything you wanted, but it means God starts to order your life in a particular way, and you'll find the fullness of life that Jesus promised. Remember when we talked about the thief? Jesus the good shepherd, the devil the thief, who comes to steal and destroy. Jesus who comes to give abundant life. And so this abundant life flows out of desire and love directly oriented towards God. And so that's really the key for us. Think about what it means to direct your desires towards God. And then maybe this opens up for you the ministry of prayer. God, now I know why I pray. I want to direct my desires to you. I want the water to be cleaned out, especially where it gets polluted. I want my desires not to control me, but I want to be free in my desires. All of this stuff now, you can see how the entire Christian life gets built on this discussion of Cupid, on desire, and how desires directed towards God begin to shape and order your life. And then you can see how these commandments here at the end actually begin to touch on all the ones that came before them. Okay, so as a kind of review, ask yourself these questions. How are these commandments, meaning number 9 and number 10, different than the ones before them? How are they different than you shall not murder, you shall not steal, you shall not commit adultery? So, what is coveting? It's a word you don't use a lot, but what is coveting? And maybe next to that, we could ask this question. Why did Pastor talk about Cupid? So what was the point of that? Now remember, we're not talking about desire being bad. Desire is not bad. So what kind of desire are we talking about here that the commandment is warning us against? So how can desire pollute? So that's an image the church used of the stream filled with clean water. How can desire pollute? Now, one way you can think about this specifically, and this is the way it was used by St. Augustine, how can desire pollute a relationship? Think of a friendship. Think about a boyfriend and a girlfriend. Think about a husband and a wife. How can desire pollute that water? What are the negatives and the positive that Luther talks about in the Small Catechism? So I gave you 2 negatives and 1 positive. How does desiring lead us on a chain of events that ultimately will lead us to breaking other commandments? 2 negatives and 1 positive. How does fearing and loving God shape desire? So if we always say at the beginning of the explanation to the commandments, we are to fear and love God, how does fearing and loving God shape desire? And then what is it that happens after God shapes our desires? All right, well, that's our video on the 9th commandment. We'll continue talking about coveting and desire next week with the 10th. And a reminder to memorize these, because you will be tested, or if not tested, quizzed on them, to kind of put it all together in your brain. We'll see you on Wednesday.